In this series called Which Way, we're talking about understanding the will of God in our life. And I'm often, as a pastor, asked, what is God's will for my life? Now, nobody ever walks into my office and says, hey, Pastor Rich, what is God's will for my life? I'd be like, dude, I have no idea. It's give me $1 million. I would probably answer that question that way. I don't know. But typically it's different. It's asked this way, kind of like, hey, I have this relationship I'm in, and I don't know what to do. Or I have this decision to make about my career, I'm not sure what's next. Or whatever, it just comes in various different forms like that. But I think what often is what I feel when I walk away, the question is, Rich, will you just be like a fortune teller for me? You know what a fortune teller is? Like you pay a fortune teller and the fortune teller tells you, your life is going to be great. You are awesome. Nothing's ever going to go wrong. You're going to become a rich person. That's what a fortune teller does. And that's not reality. And so I want to illustrate a little bit about what guidance and God's will kind of looks like. If we can dim the lights in the house. I've got here a little flashlight with me. And I think oftentimes the way God's will operates in our life, the way God, when we ask God, what's your will for my life, is what God does is he gives us sort of the flashlight approach. Like I look out there and I can't really see. I can because we have a lot of other ambient lights going on here. I can actually see, but in a really dark place, I wouldn't be able to see where's, But this flashlight helps me. It helps me with a step right in front of me. It helps me maybe with a couple steps ahead of me, but that's about it. This flashlight doesn't help me know where I need to turn left or right. It doesn't necessarily tell me where I need to end up. It just helps me over the next couple of steps. Well, the Bible is kind of that way. When we see guidance in Scripture, oftentimes it's a lot like this flashlight approach. A perfect example of this is Abraham. God comes to Abraham and says, hey, I want you to leave your home and go to a place that I'll show you. And Abraham's like, okay, where are we going? He's like, I'll tell you on the way. And then so it's like he doesn't really know. And what's really cool is you go to Hebrews chapter 11, and Abraham is commended for his faith, and this is what it says about him. It says, he went even though he did not know where he was going. Even tells us in Hebrews 11 that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so oftentimes, what God does when he's guiding us, leading us, and for us to understand his will, oftentimes what he does is he hands us a flashlight. And he says, hey, trust me. I'm giving you guidance for where you need to step, the next step, and the next step, but just trust me along the way. That's really what guidance is all about, and understanding his will. And the sooner we can embrace that, the sooner we can say, okay, God, I don't see what you see. I don't necessarily know the things that you know, but I'm going to trust you with my life. I'm going to trust you with my relationships. I'm going to trust you with my career. I'm going to trust you in all these different areas of my life, and I'm just going to take step after step after step. And what happens is, in a life lived long, trusting God, you get to a place where you have this vantage point where you look back and you realize, wow, look how far I've traveled, and it's been by trusting him step by step by step. This is really how guidance occurs in Scripture. But I think if we could raise the lights up, I think what we want, though, is more of this. This is how we want God to speak to us about his will. God, what's your will? Well, it's all there, bright and shiny. You can see everything. You know exactly where to turn. You know how to go. You know all that stuff. You know everything. And what we really want is kind of more of a fortune teller type of God that will say, your life is going to be perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. You're good. That's the kind of guidance that we oftentimes want from God, this kind of fortune teller, because when it's dim like it was earlier, we feel a little anxious. We feel a little bit overwhelmed by the darkness, and so, we just want God to be a little bit more revealing to us. Sometimes I think what we want, though, is more of a formula. Like we treat God kind of like a GPS. Like, God, here's where I want to go. It's over there. Now help me get there. We punch in the coordinates, and God just says, okay, turn right, turn left, go straight, watch the detour. But we are going where we want to go. We just want God to bless it. Sometimes I think what we want when we're thinking about his will and we want from God is just this feeling. We want to feel that we know his will. So we pray for God's will. We want to feel that his will match up with how we feel. God, what's your will for my life? We ask someone, what's your will? What's God's will for your life? And they say, well, I feel this way. Now, we need to be careful when that's how we respond about the will of God in our life. I feel this way. Because there's typically something wrong when God's will always seems to line up with your feelings of comfort and happiness. That's not always God's will. In fact, oftentimes, God's will there are moments of being very uncomfortable because God is leading you and guiding you through life. So, God's will. Today we're going to look at the life of Joseph. We're going to see that for Joseph to realize God's purpose in his life, he was going to have to go through a place of deliverance. And my prayer for us today is that you will also experience deliverance. Bad things that happened to Joseph. Very bad things have happened to Joseph. So there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of hurt in his life. But I suspect that Joseph is not alone. I suspect that there are some of you, in fact, I don't need to suspect it. I just know. I just know that there are some of you here right now that you've experienced all kinds of difficult things. You're living with guilt, with shame, with pain and bitterness and anger. Letting some things that happen to you hold you back from what God wants for you. We see this in Joseph's life as well. He was being held back by the pain and the anger. And so you need deliverance, you need healing. This week as I was praying about this message, I couldn't get away from it. Honestly, at the beginning of the week, I was saying, God, I don't really want to preach this. I don't want to go down this way because really it's gonna bring up some pain points for us, and I felt like the Lord just like, you're gonna preach it. We're gonna talk about this. And so my prayer today and this week has been, God, will you help us experience deliverance, healing, and freedom in our lives? I pray that for you. So I want you to imagine Joseph. He's 17 years old. He's been thrown into a pit. He's pleading with his brothers. Don't do this. Don't do what you're about to do. You're about to sell me off, and don't do this. But they sell him off into slavery. I mean, talk about hurt and pain that he was experiencing. It's overwhelming. I mean, it's one thing for somebody you don't know to hurt you, to do this kind of stuff, but for people that you trusted, for people that you're in relationship with, that you were counting on, for that person to do what they did to Joseph would be incredibly, incredibly painful, and the wounds would be deep. I mean, this act of cruelty destroyed Joseph's life. It completely crushed his dreams. So there's no question, when you look at the story of Joseph, there's no question, absolutely no question that Joseph was incredibly wounded. We don't dismiss that. We don't look at God's will and pretend like, oh, everything's fine, it just gets to the end. He was incredibly wounded. But Hebrews encourages us on something. In Hebrews 12, it says, watch out. There's a warning that the Hebrew writer says. He says, watch out. Like if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, pay attention to these words right here. Watch out. Be alert. Be aware. Don't just, go with the flow. Make sure you're watching out. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you. Be careful. Be careful for this seed that gets planted in your heart that sprouts up bitterness and starts taking on a life of its own. Be very careful about that. Where you get angry and you're just angry all the time. You don't even know why you're angry. You're very easily offended or ultra sensitive. And maybe you don't even understand it, but people around you know it. They feel it. They don't exactly know how to navigate the relationship with you. They're not sure what to say or what not to say because it just feels like there's just a lot of sensitivity there. Maybe you're not fully aware of it. Like the hurt was so long ago that you've kind of said to yourself, this is behind me. I'm not even thinking about it anymore, but people around you know. Like there's this poison that's just infiltrating every aspect of your life, people around you. Like you didn't mean for the anger towards your dad to be transferred to your husband. You didn't mean for the bitterness that you had towards your mom to be transferred to your wife. You didn't mean for them to pay that bill, but there's this root, and it's affecting everything. Last week, we left Joseph as the second most powerful man in Egypt. It seems like he's moving on. It seems like life is good for him. You know, he's beyond slavery. He's beyond imprisonment. He's just moving on. He's got this place of influence. Pharaoh gives him a wife. He starts having kids. He has 2 kids. He names his oldest son Manasseh. This is the definition of Manasseh. God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Now, on the surface, you think, oh, yeah, that's not good. He's talking about God done this. But here's how you know that you really haven't forgotten all your troubles. Is you name your first son, God has helped me forget all my troubles. Like every time you say, hey, Manasseh, pick up your toys. He's like, oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. I was, this happened in my life, and I can't believe it. And he's just like rehearsing it all the time, right? And I think that's what we do. I think sometimes that's where it's at. It's in our head. And it's like we say to ourselves, it was so long ago, it was no big deal. It was so long ago, but it is a big deal. And so here Joseph is 20 years later, all right? He names his son Manasseh. 20 years later, even though he's been set free from slavery, even though he's in a position of influence, he's still a slave to resentment. He's still bound by bitterness. Chapter 42, I'm going to move through this quickly, but because of Chris. The famine hits. You know the story. We talked about it last week. The 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. The famine hits, and people all over the world are starving. Well, all over that Near Eastern world are starving, including Joseph's hometown. Jacob is the father of Joseph, and he's looking at the very real possibility of his family starving to death. And so he tells us, he gets 10 of it, says to 10 of his sons, go into Egypt and buy grain. He keeps behind Benjamin because in his mind, Benjamin and Joseph, by the way, just as a recap, Benjamin and Joseph are blood brothers. They're brothers, they're sons of Rachel and Jacob. And so he's already lost Joseph, Jacob has, and so he doesn't want to lose Benjamin, so he keeps Benjamin behind. He sends the 10 older brothers to Egypt to buy grain. The brothers arrive in Egypt, and they bow before Joseph with their faces to the ground. They have no idea it's Joseph. Joseph dresses like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian. Okay. I wasn't sure if you guys were going to catch that, but okay, good. I'm glad you did. All right. But they don't really recognize him. And so this is what's going on. Verse 7 of chapter 42 says, Joseph recognized his brothers instantly. They don't recognize him, but Joseph recognizes them instantly. But he pretended to be a stranger. He spoke harshly to them. Where are you from? He demanded. So I want you to imagine this scene. Joseph's in this seat of power. Maybe he's on an elevated stage. There's lines of people coming. They're starving. They want food. They're giving out food to grain to all of these people so they can eat. And Joseph looks up and he sees in the line 10 Hebrew men. And instantly he recognizes them. And maybe a split second after that, anger begins to rise up inside of him. And suddenly he finds himself once again this 17-year-old boy who was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by his own brothers. He accuses them of being spies. He speaks to them harshly. They say, we're not spies, we're 10 brothers. We're all children of the same father. In fact, we even have another brother. His name is Benjamin. He's back with my father. They tell the whole story, but Joseph treats him harshly. He puts him in prison. And after 3 days of being in prison, maybe his heart softens a little bit, and he lets him out. And he tells him, okay, I'm going to give you food for your family, but you're going to leave your brother Simeon back. We're going to put him in prison. And you're going to go back home, and you're going to bring your younger brother Benjamin back to me to prove your story that you truly are all brothers and that you're not spies. In verse 21, it says that their brothers are having a conversation among themselves, and they're speaking in Hebrew. They don't think Joseph can understand them. They don't know that it's Joseph, and so they're speaking among themselves in Hebrew, and they're basically commenting about why they're in this situation. Look what it says in verse 21. It says, speaking among themselves, they said, clearly we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen, and that's why we're in trouble. Now, we read this as a matter of course in the text. We just kind of read through it, but do you realize that 20 years have passed? And what's so obvious is that when this trouble comes to them, what's obvious is suddenly this stuff just comes right to the top. Like they're living with this guilt and this shame, this maltreatment of their brother. They just know that this is why God is punishing them. So what I want you to see here is that we know that Joseph needs deliverance. We know that Joseph is being held back by bitterness and anger, but what you see, he's not the only one in the story that needs deliverance. Like 20 years later, his brothers are still struggling. I mean, he's out of mind. Why are they thinking about Joseph anyway? Verse 24 says this. This is how Joseph reacts to their conversation. Now he turned away from them and he began to weep. This is weeping number 1, by the way. When he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. And so here's what I want you to notice. As much as Joseph could have thought to himself, it's done, it's over, it's behind me, it was just right there on the surface. It was always there. The brothers return back to Jacob, and they tell the whole story to Jacob. Yeah, he held us, he put us in prison. They've kept Simeon back. He said that for us to prove that we're not spies, we got to take Benjamin back. And Jacob is like, you're not taking Benjamin. I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. Chapter 43, verse 1 says, but the famine continued to ravage the land of Canaan. When the grain they had brought when the grain they had brought from Egypt was almost gone, Jacob said to his sons, go back to Egypt and buy a little more food. And they respond, we can't. We can't go back there without our brother Benjamin. If we go back there without our brother Benjamin, we are proving the point that we are spies. We will be executed. Not to mention you lose all your sons, but also you get no food. You starve to death. And so Jacob finally basically has no choice, and so he concedes. They arrive back in Egypt, and verse 26 says this. They bowed down before him to the ground. They bowed down before him to the ground. I imagine that as this is happening, Joseph is reminded of a dream from 20 years earlier. He's reminded of that dream when the sheaves were bowing down. Remember that? And maybe at that very moment, Joseph began to realize, wow, the dots are connecting. Now I see, God, this was kind of like what you've been doing. He begins to understand his pain and his hurt and his anger in a different perspective, in a different context. He recognizes that everything he's gone through, the hurt and the pain, was actually used by God to accomplish his will, to bring about good. Like the dots are getting connected. He has these dreams. He thought the dreams are gone. He thought it was done. It was over. He thought those were just Taco Bell dreams or something, Verse 30 says, he was deeply moved at the sight of his brothers, and so he hurried out, and he looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room, and he wept there. This is weeping number 2. After this, he pulls himself together. He comes back out. He decides to give food to his brothers, to send them back to their father. But he schemes something. He says, I want to keep Benjamin back. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a silver cup, and we're going to plant it in Benjamin's bag. And so then we're going to send our men out there to search and accuse them of thievery. And we'll find the cup in Benjamin's bag, and we'll basically keep them back. That's the scheme. So this happens, it goes down as planned. The brothers are just so upset. They're distraught. They remember that when they left Jacob, Jacob told them, promise me on your life that you're going to bring your little brother Benjamin back home. And now there's the possibility of Benjamin actually being executed. One brother speaks up. His name is Judah. He basically says, listen, my life for his. Keep me, but spare him. This will destroy my father if you take him. My life for his. I don't know if you remember Judah, the name Judah. 20 years earlier, Judah was the one who said, hey, let's just sell him as a slave and make money off of him. Now, this same Judah is actually standing up for his little brother Benjamin. My life for his. Verse 1 of chapter 45, it says, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. Now remember who we're talking about here. We're talking about a man who has been a slave, who's been a prisoner, who is now second in command in the most powerful country in the known world. If there's anything that Joseph knew how to do, he knew how to compartmentalize. He knew how to keep his emotions in check, but this is way too much. He can't help it. He just begins to weep. Here's one thing I would say to us, that when deliverance takes place, tears are often present. It doesn't mean it always will be present. Doesn't mean you have to cry to be delivered, but when you experience supernatural deliverance, the emotions are so overwhelming, the tears just begin to flow. And God begins to bring about some pretty cool healing in our life. So they still don't know who he is. He sends all of his attendants. I want to pause here on this story for just a second, go to another story in Genesis chapter 33. This is a story of two brothers, Jacob, who is Joseph's father, and Jacob's brother, Esau. Remember that story, Jacob and Esau? Esau is Joseph's uncle. Jacob had basically, long story, but basically Jacob had cheated Esau out of his birthright. Esau is furious with Jacob, and so he's going to hunt him down. Jacob flees for his life. He's up with Laban in what's today Turkey. He's up there with getting wives and a lot of children. And he ends up over there doing that and hasn't seen Esau for more than 20 years. The day comes where he has no choice. He has to encounter his brother. He's on his way back to Canaan to live. He has to meet his brother. His brother comes at him with 400 men. He's been living in fear all this time of what might happen to him when he sees Esau. Esau comes, he's got 400 men with him, so Jacob divides his family into groups, thinking that maybe if I divide them up, at least some of them will survive, right? That's what he's thinking, because Esau was so angry at him 20 plus years before. Verse 3, it says this, then Jacob went on ahead. As he approached his brother, he bowed down to the ground 7 times before him. This is Jacob bowing down to Esau 7 times before him. Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they both wept. What is it with weeping and reconciliation? This is what happens in Genesis chapter 30. I want you to imagine for a second that story. Jacob and Esau meeting each other. And in the crowd behind Jacob was his family. And peering through the crowd was a little boy by the name of Joseph. He's just a little kid, he's young. And he sees his dad like he's never seen his dad before. Like he's probably never seen his dad bow to somebody else. He's never seen his dad cry like that. He's never seen his uncle, period. But now he sees them embracing and kissing and crying. I realize that when we talk about this subject, that it's sensitive for some. I realize that some might feel like would want to tell me, Rich, but you don't understand what was done to me. You don't understand the pain that I have suffered because of that person. And so you might be carrying a lot of resentment and bitterness around, and you're just kind of hanging on to it because of what has been done to you. And I can't really convince you. I know that you might feel very justified in that feeling. But maybe as a little bit of a motivation, keep in mind that there might be some little eyes watching you. What are they learning about grace and forgiveness from you? What are they learning about what the power of Jesus at work in our lives? We have an opportunity to disciple our kids. Christy and I mean, we're not perfect. We've fought many times, and we've tried not to do it in front of the kids, but we have. But every time we've come back and said, this is not God's way. We want them to see from our lives God's way. We might feel justified in it. Here's Joseph now. He's with his own brothers. He stands before him. He has a decision to make. Verse 4 says, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. Then when they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph. You know, the one that you sold into slavery? That one? That brother. Like he thought that they had forgotten about him, but they had not forgotten about him, obviously, because they were still reeling with guilt and shame over the fact that they did what they did. Like he doesn't pretend that they didn't do anything wrong, but he's going to offer them forgiveness. But forgiveness is not acting like what happened wasn't a big deal. It was. Verse 5 of chapter 45 says this. You see Joseph gaining perspective of God's will on his life. He says, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Like Joseph begins to connect the dots of why he is second in command in Egypt. And that connection between that and his family back in Hebron. He starts connecting these dots. So then, it was not you, this is what he says, this conclusion. It was not you who sent me here, but God. Do you see it? Do you see how when we gain perspective, when we start not looking at life through all of our pain and hurt and challenge, but instead we start looking at it through the eyes of God, how that opens the door for deliverance and healing in our life? That's exactly what's happening here with Joseph. And if you're like me, you might tell yourself, well, I've been delivered, Rich, I've been delivered. But what I think really is we've just gotten really good at just denial. That we just tell ourselves over and over again, it was so long ago, I don't even think about it anymore, but we do. I know there's a lot of pain associated, but I don't feel that pain anymore. Well, we really feel that pain. So we're just really good at denial. So what we need is deliverance, not more denial. And so Joseph can experience deliverance because he has a new understanding of God's sovereign will in his life. And he offers forgiveness to his brothers, but they never apologize. And you might be sitting here this morning saying, well, I'll forgive when they say I'm sorry. Their sorry isn't a prerequisite for your forgiveness. I've told you my story. I grew up in somewhat of a dysfunctional home. No, actually, not somewhat, a dysfunctional home. My dad was incredibly abusive, physically and verbally, associated with alcohol. He drank a lot of alcohol and happened around that time. I grew up as a teenager, I have to be honest with you, hating my dad. Like I had this just anger and hate towards my dad. I would tell people about it, and they would try to say, hey, that's too far, man. You shouldn't say those things. You shouldn't feel that way. But then I would justify it. I would pull my glasses down, and I would show a little scar on my nose where he broke my nose as a teenager when I tried to jump between him and my mom because he was beating my mom. He didn't apologize for that. He just kept moving on. So I kind of grew up with this weird emotions as a teenager. Like I hated my dad, but then there was this stuff inside of me that I just wish I had a dad that would love me and say, I'm proud of you, son, and I'm so thankful that you're my son. I wanted that, but it wasn't there. Years later, several years later, I gave my life to Jesus. We had been disconnected from my dad for some years now. I gave my life to Christ, and people around me were saying, hey, well, you need to forgive your dad, because it was like that story was always on the surface. I was always talking about it. You need to forgive your dad. And so I said, okay, I prayed to forgive my dad, and I did. As a Christian, I felt like, okay, I'm forgiving my dad. When I was in my 20s, we started having kids, and I started to feel like, well, my kids need to know that they have a grandpa that was a war veteran, that actually had commendations for valor and heroism in war. And they needed to know this stuff, so I kind of, decided to reconnect with my dad. We went to go see him in San Antonio where he was living. Here, Dad, here are your grandkids. My dad passed away in 2004. I would say to myself, all these years, it was so long ago. Like literally, it was 40 years ago. It was so long ago. I mean, I'm past that. I'm over it. My dad passed away in 2004, and 8 years after he passed away, okay, this is now 2000 and what's 4 plus 8? 12. Sorry. I'm not up here to do math right now. I'm pretty good at math, but I'm not up here to do math. 2012. And I'm sitting in my kitchen. It's emotional because Christy's actually here. Sitting in my kitchen at the bar in my kitchen. I'm the pastor of this church at that time. My dad's gone. He's like gone, literally gone. He's dead. He's in the ground. I have forgiven him, quote unquote. But I'm sitting around the bar and we're talking. We're actually having an argument. The argument typically circled around, Rich, you're kind of an absent dad and absent husband. What's up? I'll never forget that day because I don't know what happened inside of me. There was like she was probing me and it just came out. I just said it. I just don't want to be like my dad. I don't want to be like my dad. There's a whole lot I could say about that, about what that meant to me, but what was real, what was true for me was that I had, instead of releasing the pain of that past, I had repressed it. And it was in me. And I was trying to figure out a way to get around all of that. And Christy so gently just walked around the counter, put her arm around my shoulder, and we just wept together. There's weeping again. We wept together. And that afternoon, God began to do some restoration and some healing in my life. I was able to release some things. I don't know about you. Can I just say this? I was the pastor of this church, and I was affected by the stuff in my past. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know what to do with it. But that's where I was. And I suspect that there's some of you in this room right now that you too are repressing things. Sometimes instead of repressing, what we do is we rehearse it. Like we tell ourselves the story over and over again in our brain. It's like we have this thing inside of us that if I could just rehearse, if I could just tell myself over and over the story, then that person cannot get away with what they did. And really, it's destroying us. Sometimes what we do is we retaliate. Joseph was in a position to retaliate, but he didn't. He forgave. We may not be in that kind of position that Joseph was in, but we have other ways of retaliating. Sometimes we retaliate by recruiting opponents. You ever been in that situation where somebody comes to talk to you about somebody else? And they say, this is what that person did to me. And you know that person, but you don't really know them that well, and suddenly you have this idea about that person. Like you've won them over to your side, and now you have this seed that's been planted in you against that person, and you don't even know. They haven't hurt you. They haven't done anything to you, but you vicariously are offended. Sometimes we retaliate with social isolation. turn a cold shoulder. Sometimes we retaliate by criticizing, always reminding them of what they've done. But because of Jesus, what we do is we release. We release. That's a definition of forgiveness, by the way, is that you release what is owed to you. You release what is owed to you. You make the conscious decision that you're not going to demand payment anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that, that it wasn't a big deal. It doesn't mean that your healing is immediate. It doesn't mean that you make excuses for that other person. It doesn't mean that you don't press charges when a crime has been committed. It doesn't mean those things. But what it does mean is that you release it to God. Because here's what you need to understand. Your bitterness, your resentment, all that pain that you're feeling is actually infecting you and hurting you. And the only way you can find wholeness and freedom and deliverance is by simply just releasing it to God. And say, God, I trust you to take what happened to me, and I know that your will get accomplished, and I don't understand it right now. This is so painful and so hurtful. I don't get it, why this all happened, but God, I'm going to release it to you, and I trust that you're going to take it and use it for my good. I don't know how. I've got this little flashlight here, and it doesn't seem very clear how I'm going to experience that. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen, with that other relationship. I'm not sure what's going to happen in our relationship, but God, I make the choice to release it to you. I trust you with my life. And so, I want to ask you, I guess I better turn this thing off. I want to ask you, what are you owed? What are you owed this morning? For some of you, you feel like you're owed an explanation. Like what happened to you was it's like, it doesn't even make sense. Why did you do that? Why did that happen? And you want an explanation. Others of you, you feel like you need what's owed to you is a childhood, or you're owed a marriage, or you at least owed an apology. And I get that. But here's what I want you to think, because it's easy for us to think what's owed to us, but here's what I'm asking you, another question I want to ask you. What do you owe someone else? Let me tell you something. These things that happen to us in life, they're not in isolation. What I love about the story here of Joseph is that Joseph needed freedom. Joseph needed deliverance. He needed to be able to experience that deliverance in his life. He needed to be able to forgive his brothers, and in doing so, his brothers were able to forgive themselves. Like God wins all the way around as we start to understand his purposes and design for our life. So the brother who says of Benjamin, my life for his. Remember that? Did you catch his name? Judah. Judah. If you think about it, Judah actually is probably one of the more common. You hear that name a lot more than some of the other brothers of Joseph. You hear Judah more often. And what's really cool is that years later, a lion would come from that tribe. The Lion of Judah, Jesus. And Jesus would go to a cross and he would say, my life for his. He would give his life so that you and I could experience deliverance and freedom. Amen.